Hello, this is Ethan, and for my midterm project, I'm going to be talking about the effects of anxiety on brain structure. So, to give a quick outline, I'm going to define anxiety. I'll talk about symptoms and the cognitive processes that are affected when an individual has anxiety. I will speak about the prevalence of anxiety, why I think this topic is relevant, and then I'll get into how anxiety affects brain structure. And I'll specifically talk about three areas of the brain. So first, let's talk about what is anxiety. And as defined by the American Psychological Association, anxiety is an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns, and they may avoid certain social situations out of worry. They may also have physical symptoms such as sweating, trembling, dizziness, or a rapid heartbeat. Anxiety is not the same thing as fear, however, but these two words are often used interchangeably. The difference is that anxiety is considered a future-oriented, longer response that's broadly focused on a diffused threat or the possibility of a threat, whereas fear is a more appropriate and present-oriented, short-lived response to a clearly identifiable real threat. And the reason that I chose to talk about anxiety is because I think that it's very prevalent. And as you can see in this graph, this graph here shows the depicting the increasing level of people around the world who have an anxiety disorder. So, to be specific, this chart shows in 1990, approximately 195 million people, that is 74 million men and 121 million women, who were experiencing anxiety disorders in 1990 around the world. And now by 2019, there are 301 million people, that is 114 million men and 187 million women experiencing anxiety disorders around the world. So this information in this graph show that there's an evidently positive and linear relationship between time and the number of anxiety disorders worldwide, which further demonstrates why I think anxiety is so widespread and impactful and important to talk about. So why are we talking about anxiety and brain structure? According to the National Institute of Mental Health, anxiety is the number one mental illness in America. It is estimated that 31% of adults in the United States will experience an anxiety disorder at some point in their lives. And I believe that this presentation is important because by studying the relationship between anxiety and brain structure, we can learn more about how this widespread disorder impacts our physiological functions. We can learn more about how to improve early detection of anxiety, and in turn, we can improve the ways that an intervention or therapy is administered. So, the first part of the brain that I want to talk about is the frontal lobe and how anxiety causes structural changes to the frontal lobe. In a study conducted by Bester et al., these results showed that subclinical levels of anxiety and somatization were associated with changes in the structure of various brain regions, mainly the prefrontal cortex. These regions are known to be involved in various cognitive and emotional processes like attention, emotion regulation, and decision making. And the study also found that the severity of these subclinical anxiety symptoms was positively correlated with the extent of the structural changes in the brain. So these findings suggest that even a mild symptom of anxiety, mild sustained symptoms of anxiety could have an impact on the brain structure, potentially affecting a multitude of cognitive and emotional processes. So overall, this first study highlights the importance of early awareness and the management of anxiety because they could have a significant impact on brain structure and function, even in an initially minimal symptom. So in this second study, researchers used an MRI to examine differences in brain structure between patients with MDD, that is major depressive disorder, and patients with MDD and anxiety, and both of these were compared to healthy controls. So the results showed that patients with MDD and anxiety had a reduced gray matter volume in several brain regions, more substantially than the patients with solely made MDD, and of course, more so than the healthy controls. So the several brain regions that had reduced gray matter volume were the left inferior frontal gyrus and the left insula. So an additional study conducted in 2018 concluded that higher anxiety and depressive symptoms were significantly associated with a reduced cortical thickness in the frontal pole and the rostral middle frontal gyrus. So overall, this third experiment points to the fact that anxiety and depression may cause cortical thinning in overlapping and distinct regions in the brain in childhood and in adolescence. So now I'm going to speak about how anxiety impacts the amygdala. A study conducted by Etkin et al. Titled Disrupted Amygdalar Subregion Functional Connectivity and Evidence of a Compensatory Network in Generalized Anxiety Disorder. That's a long title, I know, but this study provides new insights into the neuroanatomy of the human amygdala. So, in generalized anxiety disorder, they found evidence of an intraamygdalar abnormality, as well as a dysfunction in the connection of the amygdala with at least two distinct brain networks. A second study, researchers Abend et al. Used an fMRI to examine brain responses to anticipated threats, and the study used healthy participants that were aged 6 to 23 years old. So these results showed that individuals with higher anxiety scores had greater anticipatory threat responses in several brain regions, like the amygdala and hippocampus. So the researchers suggest that anticipatory threat responding may be a useful indication or even a biomarker for anxiety, which shows that early interventions may help prevent the development of anxiety disorders. A second study that was conducted in 2020 examined the severity of symptoms of anxiety. The findings indicate that subclinical symptoms of anxiety are associated with reduced gray matter volume in brain regions involved in emotion regulation and processing, such as the amygdala. Furthermore, this study will highlight the severity of subclinical symptoms, how that's positively correlated with reductions in gray matter volume in that region. So lastly, through my research, I also found that anxiety is statistically connected to structural changes in the hippocampus. In fact, the same 2020 study conducted by Abend et al. Demonstrated that anxiety contributed to a greater anticipatory threat response in the hippocampus as well as the amygdala, which I alluded to. Furthermore, a study performed in 2010 concluded that patients with generalized social anxiety disorder, or otherwise known as generalized social phobia, or shown on the slide, GSP, these types of patients had significantly reduced amygdalar and hippocampal volume in comparison to controlled subjects that did not have anxiety. So to recap, I talked about how anxiety affects the frontal lobe, and specifically these areas in the frontal lobe that are listed: the prefrontal cortex, the left inferior frontal gyrus, the frontal pole, and the rostral middle frontal gyrus. And as a reminder, the frontal lobe is the largest lobe in the human brain, and it deals with expressive language, decision-making, and higher level functions. I talked about how anxiety affects the amygdala, which is involved in emotional processing, arousal, and fear and stress responses. And lastly, I talked about how anxiety affects the hippocampus, which has a major role in learning and memory, and it is one of the most plastic and vulnerable structures that can be damaged by a variety of stimuli. And a lot of studies show that that the hippocampus gets affected in a variety of neurological disorders. So since the hippocampus is involved in storing and retrieving explicit memories, its connections to the amygdala may be the origin of strong emotions triggered by certain memories. So overall, the research that I found validates the belief that anxiety can damage cognitive ability, and therefore these changes to brain structure that I talked about should be used to identify recurring anxiety in patients and develop treatments that target specific brain regions, especially regions that are involved in emotional regulation and processing. Here are my sources, and thank you very much for listening.